Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Those of you who just joined us, I'm Mike Scott. I'm the director of the Future of the Humanities project, which is sponsored by Georgetown University. And I'd just like to, at this stage, to say a grateful thanks to Georgetown, to Jack DeGioia, the president of Georgetown, to Tom Banchoff, who's here, who's the vice president of Georgetown, responsible for global affairs. They've been extraordinary in their generosity in setting up this conference and the conference that's going to follow it, which will be on March the 18th at the Dulwich Picture Gallery, and will be on art history in particular, and be the future of art history. We've had already an embarrassment of riches with two magnificent talks this afternoon. And now we've got an embarrassment of riches on the panel that we have here. John Drakakis comes back onto the panel, and I introduced him earlier, but his radical interpretations of Shakespeare, together with a group of scholars, changed the nature of Shakespearean studies in the 1980s. And as a lecturer during that period, it was just so exciting. In fact, I've been very blessed in my career as a lecturer and professor in English to have gone through such an exciting period of change. And we want to take that through. And we want people to be able to have that experience of humanities and humanities subjects onwards. You know, in 1912, only 7% of the male population and virtually 0% of the female population went on to secondary education. And there was a debate as to whether they should do or not, whether you brought in compulsory secondary education. It was turned down. It was turned down. Why? Well, we needed them to be working in the fields. We needed them to be keeping the economy going. We didn't wish them to be educated, although they didn't say that. And what happened to them? Well, you know what happened to them. That's why we're wearing poppies. That's what happened to them. 1st of July, 1916, the opening day of the Battle of the Somme, 60,000 English troops were killed, and presumably about the same number of German troops. In an area that's hardly the size of one end of St. John's to the other. Uneducated. They hadn't got the humanities. I'm not saying the humanities is the panacea for everything, but we do criticise, we do evaluate, and we do act as a conscience. And out of that war, of course, we did get the writings, and I'll never forget, as a young boy, reading Goodbye to All That by Robert Graves, which taught me about war and taught me about peace. And so, very poignant at the moment because of the anniversary of the end of that First World War. And I've been blessed for my lifetime, except for wars outside of the UK, not to be involved in war, as most of you here haven't been involved. So that's one reason why I believe also in the humanities and in what we do in trying to teach the humanities in order to be critical. I want to introduce Helen Small to you, who's written a fabulous book called The Value of the Humanities, articulate, clear, telling us the arguments used to justify the humanities. And Helen, congratulations, she's just been made the Merton Professor of English just 3 weeks ago. She hasn't had a payslip yet, so she's not quite sure whether it's actually real or not. And knowing universities, perhaps it's not, but it's terrific. But we had a seminar earlier in September, and Helen presented to that seminar, and really set us on fire with what she said. I'm going to ask Helen to introduce our keynote speaker today. It's Terry Eagleton. Helen Small.
It is a pleasure and an honour. Is this working? Is that working? Yes. That's fine. Okay. It's a pleasure and an honour to welcome back Terry Eagleton, formerly and for long a member of this parish, or rather this thicket of parishes. I'm convinced there is some kind of Catholic logic to the fact that you have 3 people on the stage of whom only one speaks. This is really trivialising, isn't it? I'll move on. Currently Distinguished Professor of English Literature at Lancaster University. He was the Thomas Wharton Professor of English Literature here from 1992 to 2001. And prior to that, an undergraduate student, a graduate student, a junior research fellow, and then fellow and tutor, with a clutch of college affiliations to his name. So it's just as well for him, probably, that he got out, though we mourn his absence. He has long been and remains one of the most influential critics and theoreticians and journalists, a good word in my vocabulary, in the humanities anywhere in the world. Like many of you, I suspect, and I'm sorry if this sounds a bit like what Raymond Briggs may be faced with every time people mention the snowman, I came to his writing first via literary theory and introduction. As an undergraduate student in New Zealand, it remains indispensable reading for anybody wanting to understand the reshaping of not just English literature, but the humanities as a discipline or set of disciplines over the last 50 years, though it has itself now become a historic text and one that Terry has helped to historicise for us. His writing, whether he is on the subject of the aesthetic or of materialism or theology or the popular or fundamentalism, has a rare set of virtues. He has huge range. He has absolute lucidity. He has wit, often caustic wit. He has a recognition that I think advocacy for the humanities would be well equipped to have more of in it. And that is a recognition that if you're going to go around putting ideals and virtues to other people, a modicum of cynicism can be a valuable ally. His theoretical affiliations have changed over the years, as you'd expect. It would be very odd if they hadn't. But he's always remained true to the aim of keeping a serious political and theological and cultural conversation going on as openly as possible between the academy, as they call it in America, and the society beyond. We're going through a period, many of you will know, especially if you're in English, in which there are a lot of encouragements to step back or step aside from criticism, or in a limiting sense of the word, from critique. Do you want to take it? So, no, go on, we want to hear. So there are a lot of encouragements to step aside from criticism or critique, out of what I think is a misguided sense that criticism is elitist or undemocratic or simply unfriendly and against the spirit in which most people want to engage with culture. Terry is one of the people that I'm confident I can say we here look to remind us of what a keen, humanistic, trained intelligence can contribute to the public conversation on topics that matter to us most. I'm just going to give you a tiny 2-sentence or 3-sentence sample. Terry's reviewing here in January of last year a book that you've probably come across if you're teaching English, and a lot of our graduate students have been very drawn to. A book that worries me by Rita Felsky called The Limits of Critique, much as I like Rita. And Terry writes, the critics of critique need to remind themselves that there is a lot of self-deception about. Felsky teaches in a country that elected an authoritarian buffoon to the White House. There are indeed concealed truths, dissembled powers, and illusory appearances. In being chary of the seductions of depth, we should not fall for the phenomenalism according to which things are always simply as they appear. I'll skip the bit in which he pulls Marx and Brecht in to do some of the work there. One of the most scandalous insights of late modernity, he then reminds us, of Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Freud in particular, is that a certain self-delusion is essential, even salutary for human existence. Indeed, Nietzsche would seem to hold that all cognition is miscognition, though it's hard to know how we can know this. On this view, false consciousness is a chronic condition. If this is true, however, it serves as much an argument against critique as one in its favour. And what I love about this ending is that almost anyone called on to speak for the value of the humanities would just push the critique line in. But being him, he keeps the problem open. For one thing, how are critiques practitioners to avoid delusion themselves long enough to expose its insidious presence in works of art? And for another thing, what is the point of doing so if, like some ghastly stuff in a science fiction movie, it knits together again the moment we have dispelled it? So I'll be surprised if he can solve all our problems for us today, but I'm absolutely convinced he will give us a sharper and better articulation than we're likely to hear from anyone else. Thank you.
Can you hear that at the back? All right? Is it okay? I was wandering around Blackwell's bookshop earlier on, putting my books in more prominent positions. And suddenly I was seized by a memory, a most embarrassing memory, of having been there a few years ago and seeing a stand of books of subjects made simple, chemistry made simple, sociology and so on. And standing beside it was a friend of mine, a very distinguished Oxford philosopher, who was leafing through the Philosophy Made Simple volume. So seizing the chance of a jape, I crept up behind him and murmured in his ear, "That's a bit difficult for you, isn't it?" And he swung around and it wasn't my friend at all. Total stranger. Just remember this alarmed look. I was too distressed even to apologize. I scampered out of the store and just more or less ran down Broad Street. Somewhere in the world, there is a man who believes that people in Oxford are so odiously elitist that they jeer openly at ordinary people trying to improve their minds. Well, wherever he is, I apologize most grovelingly to him. Well, to continue for the moment in anecdotal vein, a few years ago I was shown around what I think is the largest university in South Asia by its proud president, a man who waxed lyrical about the cutting-edge, ultra-modern character of the campus, and who was flanked rather sinisterly, I thought, by two sort of grim-faced young heavies, sort of minders in dark suits and shades with earpieces, and for all I know, concealed Kalashnikovs beneath their jackets. And once the president had done singing the praises of his sublime business school and magnificent managerial centre and the like, I asked him why there seemed to be no critical studies in this otherwise utopian setup. He looked at me as though I'd asked him how many PhDs in pole dancing they awarded each year, and replied in a rather strangulated tone, "Your point will be noted." He then produced some gleaming technological device from his pocket, flipped it open, and spoke a couple of words of Korean into it, probably "kill him." And then, after a while, a car the length of a cricket pitch arrived, probably bulletproofed and equipped with a supply of his blood, in case of would-be humanistic assassins. And he was whisked away, no doubt wondering why Englishmen are so incurably stupid. It was all a far cry from my 30 years here at Oxford, where when I first arrived, typing rather than handwriting a note to one's colleague was considered rather vulgar, and the only technology around the place was an ingenious little device in the senior common room for hoisting the port and Madeira up from the butler's pantry to the dessert table, which some of my colleagues considered rather too much of a concession to modernity. I suppose what the Korean incident signifies is that we're currently living through an event as momentous in its own way as the discovery of penicillin or Sinead O'Connor's conversion to Islam, namely the final capitulation of university education on a global scale to the priorities of advanced capitalism. Nothing very new in that. Having resisted this development myself for some years, I've now decided just to throw in the towel. It's now my practice at the beginning of a class to ask the students how many of them can afford my £100 insights into the text in question, as opposed to one or two mildly intelligent perceptions costing around about a quarter of that. Yes. I then divide the class into various sectors accordingly, rather like an infant school, and I speak to them separately at different levels of complexity and sophistication, depending on how much they can pay. Now, for those fanatical egalitarians who would dismiss this as offensively hierarchical, let me make it clear that the less well-heeled students are offered an opportunity to put down a deposit on my brightest ideas and pay the rest off weekly. Or if even this proves beyond their budget, to perform a few little domestic tasks for me in exchange for a few aperçus about Milton or Proust. I mean, as a radical, I've always been concerned to narrow the gap between academia and everyday life, and having graduate students iron my socks or take the garbage out in return for a little chat about the heroic couplet or whatever it happens to be, it strikes me as a positive mood in this direction. I'd like, if I can, to avoid, probably I won't be able to, I'd like, if I can, ideally to avoid the phrase crisis of the humanities, not only because it's a cliche, but because there's a sense perhaps in which it's a tautology, rather as business ethics is an oxymoron. Samuel Beckett once remarked that he had a strong weakness for an oxymoron. And of course the word oxymoron in Greek is indeed an oxymoron. It's a tautology. The phrase the crisis of the humanities is a tautology in a sense, I suppose, because the sense in which the humanities have always been in crisis or have been the symptom or product of a crisis. Crisis and the humanities go together like Coke and Charlie Sheen, basically. I make that reference just to show you I'm not simply some stuffy, dull, aged intellectual. I know what's going on in the world, and so on. I know who Beyoncé is and all that kind of thing. I mean, it's not as though there was once a formation known as the humanities in full working order that then somehow was blown off course, either because of internal reasons or external ones. On the contrary, I suppose it was out of a certain historical crisis that the humanities emerged in the first place. As we know them today, the humanities and industrial capitalism were born pretty much at a stroke, yes, around the turn, let's say, of the 18th century. Values which could find increasingly little place in this new and aggressive, acquisitive, utilitarian social order had to take up a home somewhere else. And as the 19th century drew on, this protected enclave, which increasingly came to stand in for religion, of course, but that's another story, went under a whole series of names: Geist, the arts, culture, civilization, the humanities, and so on, because it was structurally distinct from the rest of the social order. It was able to act as a fairly forceful critique of it. There was some daylight, so to speak, between it and the rest of society. But by the same token, this distance generally ensured that the critique was fairly ineffectual. It was as though the human body had been split down the middle, part of it turned into an efficiently laboring or efficiently profit-making, self-disciplined instrument, yet only by siphoning off the kinds of energies which were dysfunctional in this regard: spiritual, symbolic, creative, erotic, and so on, into some other sphere altogether, whatever you called it, and its name, as I say, changed, where those capacities could be nurtured and cultivated behind some cordon sanitaire, which insulated them from the contaminating influences of society at large at the very same time as they claimed to have some critical purchase upon that social order. The humanities could still lend support to the ruling powers, still did in many ways, but more obliquely and more conditionally so than they had previously. And yet another name for this protected enclave was, of course, the university, seen as a centre of humane critique. And as its name suggests, it was also a place which sought to promote some general or universal vision of humanity in a social order which was becoming alarmingly specialised and fragmented. The arts also sought to promote such a vision. They'd come loose, in a sense, from the social system as a whole and couldn't any longer justify their existence as media of a dominant power, as they previously could. I mean, in the good old pre-modern days, so to speak, there were jobs for artists. You know, you exist to flatter a patron or praise a monarch or recount the heroic history of the tribe or entertain the court or play a part in the worship of God. Yes, so the arts could still be seen as, in some sense, cultic, institutionalized. But as William Blake recognized, they were now becoming part of general commodity production. They were thrown open to the winds of the marketplace, addressed not to a knowable audience, not to God or monarch or patron, but to any anonymous consumer who had the power, the money to buy them, and the taste to appreciate them. Now, for a certain vein of radical romanticism, this increasing lack of an established function, this question of what were the arts or humanities for, which I take it is being pursued at this conference, was in a sense precisely the point. By a certain perverse logic, a tradition of radical romanticism could always argue that their point was to be gloriously pointless in a social order in which increasingly anything that lacked utility, it lacked value. So that, strangely, a radical or even revolutionary function could be plucked from this dysfunctional condition. And that function was precisely critique. For the first time, really, the arts could be independent enough of power to turn on it and try to hold it to account. And it was the market, paradoxically, which had enabled this, which had allowed them to do so, severing the arts from their traditional, established, cultic or religious or ideological functions and setting them free, so to speak, to be for everybody and nobody. Yeah. So virtue of a kind could be wrested from the jaws of historical necessity, alienation turned to a constructive end, and the disabling distance of dysfunctionality converted into the enabling one of spiritual transcendence. The work of art could find a new destiny for itself by trying to resist the commodity form, while knowing, of course, it was indeed itself a commodity. And the last doomed attempt at this kind of freedom and autonomy was known as modernism, a current which happened at the same moment in the early 20th century as culture itself was becoming a full-blown industry, as culture was becoming increasingly interwoven with everyday life, as in postmodernism, but where the sources of cultural authority and power were less and less the traditional forces of the gallery or university or museum and so on. Some decades later, to complete this surreally brief history of Western civilization, culture largely came to embrace the process of commodification, became locked into the late capitalist order, and since there was now really no daylight between itself and that order, and thus no critical distance, more or less abandoned its traditional role of critique. And I think it isn't accidental that at roughly the same historical moment, the universities were doing much the same. And this, as I say, becoming essentially instruments of advanced capitalism. This is particularly scandalous, I think, in a country like this, which has always rightly rejected the appalling idea that education should be a commodity, a view which is, of course, alive and well in the United States. There'll now follow occasionally from time to time some typical British leftist anti-American comments. So let me just say that some of my best friends are American. In fact, 3 of my children are American. So, you know, what better legitimacy could you have than that? There are 1 or 2 private universities in Britain, but nobody knows where they are, really. It was the state that footed the bill for my own education at Cambridge, for which I didn't pay a bean. Admittedly, this was in the early period of the Industrial Revolution, when only a tiny elite of people attended university. And I think that reliance on the state for a prolonged period of time, 8 years or so at Cambridge, has actually affected my fibre, you know, as so many Americans believe that too much reliance on the state, you know, weakens your spiritual robustness. You know, I'm not sure I could defend my family with a shotgun, you know, against some intruder or burglar, as the man of the family one's supposed to do. And I do blame this on this craven dependency on the state that I had. It infiltrates your bloodstream. You know, you may not know it, but you're no longer really the man that you thought you were. I mean, most British students, of course, believe quite properly that it's the community's moral duty to educate their young, not treat it like selling an insurance policy. And there's no problem of financing that, of course. It's done in Germany, it's done in Scotland, other places. And if we in Britain could lay our hands on the untold billions stolen from the people in tax avoidance and tax evasion by the rich, then there really wouldn't be any problem in financing that. And if that wasn't enough, then we could always take a few banks into public ownership and rehire their chief executives after a lengthy period of penance, fasting and self-flagellation for their sins as cleaners and doormen and so on. There's a small class of exceedingly rare objects, phenomena, things, which are, as the jargon has it, autotelic, which is to say, which have their ends in themselves. The greatest of these, of course, is God, who is his own ground, reason, end, and origin, his own raison d'être. God, atheist and believer can agree at least on this. God is utterly pointless, entirely pointless, which of course is a completely orthodox theological notion. Another of these strange autotelic phenomena is evil, which seems mysterious because it's not about being very, very, very wicked. You know? It's a special and extremely rare, thankfully very rare, form of wickedness, namely the, I suppose what Jacques Lacan calls jouissance, the obscenely pleasurable orgy of destruction purely for its own sake, in which we can detect the stealthy motions of the death drive, yes. There's a remarkably cheap and extraordinarily attractive book on this topic called On Evil, written by myself. I mean, to say that God created the world is not, of course, as I'm sure you know, a statement about how the world got started, as old-fashioned 19th century rationalists like Richard Dawkins tend to think. I said I did an interview with the student magazine, the student newspaper here, maybe a few years ago, in which I said, say Richard Dawkins fell off his bike tomorrow. I can't remember what point I was making, but anyway, and he did actually the next day. I have a strange power, a very, very strange power. And Dawkins referred to this wryly as his leg was up on the sofa and so on. One of the greatest of all theologians, whose followers live just across St. Giles, Dominican friars, Thomas Aquinas, thought it perfectly conceivable that the world had no origin at all, as of course his great mentor Aristotle did. Aquinas didn't in fact believe that because of the book of Genesis, but he thought it perfectly rational to believe that the universe didn't have any beginning, but he nevertheless believed in the doctrine of creation because he didn't think it was anything to do with that, nothing to do with big bangs or cosmic soups, all of which is properly atheistic stuff, properly scientific stuff. It has to do, among a lot of other things, with the fact that the world, being God's, shares in his autotelic nature, that's to say, exists purely for itself, purely for its own delight, and nowhere is that more apparent in humanity, or at least in what humanity under changed conditions could be. Like God, it exists or should exist entirely for its self-delight, and therefore resembles a work of art far more than it resembles some piece of industrial manufacture. I mean, the world. There's hardly any reference in the Christian gospel to God as manufacturer, God as creator, just as there's almost nothing at all about sex, which is the only thing, of course, that many Christians ever think about, except for a rather laid-back passage with the woman of Samaria. So the doctrine of creation, I suppose, among other things, includes the idea that, like the work of art, the world is, its existence is purely gratuitous. And if you like, the modernist work is one, among other things, which is trying to take on board the scandalous fact that it has no necessity or foundation in reality and might just as well not exist. In other words, the doctrine of creation has something to do with the pure contingency of every conceivable form of existence, apart, of course, from God, who's the only necessary being. So there's absolutely no need for the cosmos at all. That's part of the doctrine of creation, just as there's certainly no need, for Justin Bieber or Lady Gaga. God created the universe on this doctrine out of love, not out of need. He doesn't need anything. He doesn't desire. He loves, but he doesn't desire. And human beings on this theory then are at their finest when they too are gloriously pointless, just like works of art. They have no more need than their creator does to justify their existence at some sour-faced tribunal of utility, or to adopt a more technical theological term, they exist just for the hell of it. Or at least they should do. They should do. At the moment, of course, the vast majority of men and women on the planet, like the great majority of those who have lived and died, exist for the power and profit of a few. So much so that the gloomiest philosopher who ever wrote, Arthur Schopenhauer, who's so glum he's unwittingly funny, there's something kind of funny about unremitting gloom, something perverse about it. Yeah. Was at least courageous enough to say, well, it would probably have been better for a huge number of people if they had never lived at all. Yeah. And what one might call the politics of creation insists that this condition, this wretched condition, has to be transformed. For the radical romantic lineage, which in fact includes very centrally Karl Marx, who was a very strange crossbreed of an Enlightenment rationalist and a romantic humanist, you have to create a society in which, as far as feasible, men and women can realize their energies and capacities purely for their own sake, rather than for the power and profit of a few. And Marx thought that an absolutely necessary precondition of that was the drastic shortening of the working day. That's to say, to use technology not to pump more surplus value out of people, but actually to try and abolish as far as possible various kinds of unpleasant toil. Marx thought that the self-realization of human beings' powers and capacities, which is almost a mantra in his work, was that's essentially what ethics is about. That is ethics, where Marx, in a very traditional Aristotelian way, sees ethics not as responsibility or duty or obligation or all of those rather unpleasant Puritan and Kantian things, but as self-fulfillment, as self-realization. And the political question is, what kind of material conditions would you need for that to be available to as many people as possible? That self-fulfillment for him, unlike for the classical liberal tradition, has to go on reciprocally or mutually. As he says in the Communist Manifesto, the single most influential document of 19th century Europe, the free development of each will be the condition of the free development of all. Free development of each will be the condition of the free development of all. And when that happens interpersonally, when that happens between particular individuals, where one individual's self-realization or fulfillment becomes the condition and ground of that of the other, then that's known as love. And what Marx is looking for is what some Marxist theorists have called political love. That's to say, what would be the political equivalent of that at the level of a whole society? Anyway, and it's this vision of powers and capacities as to be cultivated as ends in themselves that, of course, the humanities traditionally existed to foster. And Marx is one of the best exponents of this essentially, in the very positive sense, aesthetic way of seeing, yes? Good sense of aestheticism. It's not accidental that Oscar Wilde was both an aesthete and a socialist. Those two things are very closely connected in his work. Marxism, in other words, is about leisure and not about labour. Doesn't like labour and wants to try and abolish it as far as it can. So there are only two good reasons really for being a Marxist. One is just to annoy people you don't like, people you bump into at cherry parties and so on. And the other is because you don't like have to work. So that's, yeah. Suitably reorganized, so Marx considered, the fabulous wealth which capitalism has accumulated. And don't forget that there's no greater singer of praise of capitalism than Karl Marx. The Communist Manifesto is a paean of praise to what he calls the most revolutionary class in history, which has accumulated not only fabulous material riches, which can then potentially lay the basis for socialism, but also spiritual and cultural ones too, of which Marx himself was a product. And at that point, when you reorganize things in that way, so Marx considered, then history could begin. Everything that's happened so far has been, as it were, pre-history, just another tedious variant on some structure of exploitation or oppression. And what true history would look like, of course, Marx has notoriously, famously, hardly anything to say about, because if you try, he was very opposed to blueprints of the future, to utopianism in that sense, because the only image of the future is the failure of the present. And anyway, if you try to create an image of the future, you will inevitably be extrapolating from the language of the present, which is all we have, and therefore you wouldn't really be giving an image of it at all. Walter Benjamin reminds us that the Jews were forbidden to foretell the future, forbidden to create, as it were, graven images of the future. Yahweh is, of course, the God of the future, I shall be what I shall be, he's made to say in the Hebrew scriptures, and to try and create an image of that is impossible because it transcends the limits of one's language and of one's thinking. Just as you can't make a graven image of God, not only you can't make it of the future, but you can't make a graven image of God because the only image of God is people, is flesh and blood, is men and women. Otherwise, you're just a fetishist. Judeo-Christianity is, in that sense, profoundly iconoclastic. Marx, as a secular Jew, is a prophet, but not in the mistaken sense of being a clairvoyant, peering into the future, peering into the entrails of the system, so to speak, and assuring its rulers that their profits are safe for another 10 or so years. That's not, in fact, what the Old Testament, the Old Testament is a bit of an anti-Semitic term. The Hebrew scriptures see the prophet as doing. The prophet is not largely a clairvoyant. He's somebody who says that unless you change your ways in the present and seek for justice, then there ain't going to be a future, or at least it will be highly unpleasant. Leisure, not labour, for Oscar Wilde, who I mentioned previously, in his magnificent pamphlet, The Soul of Man Under Socialism. Wilde pushes this rather beyond Marx. For Wilde, we would in an ideal society just sort of lie around the place all day in various interesting postures of jouissance, sipping absinthe, wearing loose crimson garments, and reading Homer to each other. And that would just be the working day. I won't begin to describe what it is. Speaking of absinthe, one of Wilde's rather shady, louche poetic companions remarked once that absinthe makes the tart grow fonder. So it's no accident that Wilde was a socialist and an aesthete together. And when Marx comes to consider the idea of production, a paradigm of production, a model of production, he thinks not of coal mines or cotton mills, he thinks of the work of art. Why? Because the work of art is an image for him of, potentially at least, the expenditure of energies for their own sake, autotelism. So that for this lineage, there's no need to justify the existence of the humanities any more than there's a need to justify a smile or a sob. Isn't this, though, too privileged and patrician a view? I mean, doesn't it smack a bit too much of hoisting those Madeira bottles up from the butler's pantry? Well, think again of Wilde, who was the perfect English gentleman in the way that only one who wasn't, in fact, English and was notoriously imperfect and only very dubiously a gentleman could be, but who saw with astonishing kind of intellectual impudence that an aristocratic notion of culture of a certain kind could be recycled in progressive form. The leisure of a privileged upper class could be perversely read as proleptic of a future in which the great majority of men and women could also be free of toil, of hard labour. And Wilde would no doubt have been properly disgusted by the American habit of rising at the crack of dawn and going to bed at 9 o'clock in the evening, understanding as he did that any truly civilized nation seeks to stay in bed as long as possible in the morning and stay out of it as long as possible at night. But if the humanities are in trouble, it isn't only because of the Philistinism of our redneck rulers. There are certain seismic upheavals, have been certain seismic upheavals within them as well, which can perhaps best be summarized by suggesting that in late modernity, the humanities, or if you like, culture, has shifted over from being part of the solution to being part of the problem. Is there some water there? What do I mean by that? Well, shifting over from being part of the solution to being part of the problem is rather reminiscent of the German satirist Karl Kraus's view of psychoanalysis, which he memorably described as part of the problem to which it offers a solution. But put it this way, in 19th century Europe, the humanities could be seen as an answer to, a way of resolving or reconciling certain political conflicts, certain real-world social upheavals. Why? How? Well, because they stood supposedly for what it meant to be essentially human, at a level which was thought to cut beneath our relatively superficial differences and dissensions, a terrain on which we could congregate and meet in our pure humanity, yes? And if the arts were important, it was because that's too abstract an idea in itself, and it needs concretization. You need to be able to, as it were, hold that in your hand. You need some palpable version of that consensus. You need to invest that abstraction with a sensuous body, and that's part of what the arts were around to do. They were a peculiarly portable version of the values by which we lived, which in good old English style, you don't go around wearing on your sleeve, you don't wear your ideology on your sleeve, you dissolve it into the textures of everyday life, but come a political crisis of sufficient magnitude, then you may indeed have to appeal to what fundamentally you live by, in which case the arts are standing by, so to speak, to be wheeled on stage, and various other discourses, religion perhaps as well. So the arts was a kind of peculiarly portable version of the values by which you lived. If you wanted your colonial subjects to know what it meant to be civilized, instead of giving them some tedious sermon or lecture which would put them to sleep, you could always hand them a volume of Shakespeare, which might put them to sleep as well. One of the problems with this version of a common humanity, an admirable idea otherwise, of course, was that it seemed able to survive only by suspending or ignoring human difference. And it was these differences that then gradually came to the fore in later modernity, indeed in our own time. The single most supremely successful radical movement of the late modern age was not socialism or feminism or anarchism, it was revolutionary nationalism, which in the middle of the last century detached one client state after another from its imperial masters and transfigured the face of the earth, And culture for revolutionary nationalism, far from being a solution to political struggle, is very much part of the problem. The very language in which the conflict is articulated, culture in the broad anthropological sense of kinship, tradition, identity, history, language, custom, symbol, community, so on, that was now the very medium in which certain key political struggles were being waged, which was not the case with the traditional industrial struggle, the class struggle, for example. And the same, of course, is to be true of the various forms of identity politics which followed in the wake of that revolutionary nationalism, so that culture was now itself a terrain of contention, which was hardly the case for Diderot or Schiller or Arnold or the early Thomas Mann. Indeed, from the standpoint of a more traditional liberal humanist conception of culture or the humanities, the very phrase cultural politics has the smack of an oxymoron about it, like the famous one, military intelligence, or Mormon intellectual. I hope there are none here. Why? Because culture and the humanities actually constituted themselves in part by disowning what they saw as the degraded and contentious domain of the political. But now, in a new movement, culture, and in our own time, culture can be summarily defined as what people are prepared to kill for. Culture is what people are prepared to kill for, or die for. I mean, nobody has ever been prepared to kill for Balzac, or Berlioz, except perhaps for a few seriously weird people hiding away in caves somewhere, too ashamed to come out and confront the rest of us. So in the aesthetic sense of culture, that's certainly nothing like that has been at stake. But certainly in the anthropological sense, that's so. And this then spelt the gradual demise of, if you like, a certain ideology of the humanities, for which the humanities were, among other things, politically disinterested. One that we have really yet, perhaps, to replace with something else. It certainly can't, in my view, be replaced by a mere celebration of difference and plurality and diversity and inclusivity and marginality and so on. The mantras of postmodernism. There's nothing inherently positive about marginality. Neo-Nazis are marginal. Long may they remain so. There's nothing inherently positive about diversity. How many fascist parties do you want? Or plurality. One of the concepts which has been disastrously written out of such presently popular political discourse is solidarity. It wasn't difference or diversity that brought down the apartheid regime of South Africa or the neo-Stalinist setups in Eastern Europe. It was solidarity, which by no means necessarily rides roughshod over diversity. Right? But perhaps the essential move is one from seeing our common humanity as a given to seeing it as a project to be politically accomplished, so that perhaps one should respond to the phrase common humanity rather as Mahatma Gandhi did when he asked what he thought, famously was asked what he thought of British civilization, and replied that he thought it would be a very good idea. In other words, he was thinking of the future, what might be accomplished, not giving a commentary on what was around the place. And I think that to do this would mean reaching beyond the kind of humanism underpinning so much of the humanities, which for all its fine achievements has been both hubristic and self-admiring. It means, for example, accepting that to be human is in the first place to be an animal. To be a human being is in the first place, whatever more sexy and glamorous things we can get up to, it has to be on the basis of the fact that we are lumps of natural material stuff, and that is profoundly antithetical to the dominant ideology of culturalism and postmodernism. Man, comments the philosopher Alexander Kojève, is a fatal disease of the animal. For Thomas Aquinas, to refer to him again, human rationality is essentially an animal rationality. We think as we do, roughly because of the kinds of bodies we have. Our thought is discursive, extending in time, because that's the way our senses are. If a lion could speak, Wittgenstein famously remarks, we would not be able to understand what it said, because its body, and therefore its practical material form of life, is just too different from ours, and for Wittgenstein, concepts are interwoven and interlaced into our material, practical, institutional forms of existence. Aquinas might have said the same about an angel. If an angel could speak, we probably wouldn't be able to understand what he said, though St. Luke thinks he does. Aquinas would have believed would certainly have believed, I think, in the disembodied soul of Michael Jackson, if he'd had the misfortune to know who Michael Jackson was, but he certainly wouldn't have thought that it was Michael Jackson. Most certainly would not have thought that the disembodied soul of Michael Jackson was Michael Jackson, because Michael Jackson is a corporeal identity like any other human identity. Humanity, then, is that curious animal which has established itself on the basis of a distance from and disavowal of its own creatureliness. And the humanities have traditionally reflected something of this spiritual supremacism. For Christian theology, by contrast, history turns on the animality of God, otherwise known as Jesus. I think one of the other, I'll end by this, sorry to be going on so long, one of the other great defects of the version of the humanities traditionally available is that it isn't a sufficiently tragic one. As within the United States, where part of the dominant American ideology, as you know, is a blasphemous and hubristic voluntarism, which believes that if only you put your will to something, you can do it, which is terrified of the finite material nature of humanity, and which sees the human being as essentially immaterial, driven by its will and capable of, as it were, well-nigh infinite achievement. You know, in no other nation than the United States does one hear the mantra, I can do anything I want to do. Well, I can be anything I want to be. What, a banana? You know, ludicrous ideological rubbish. Yeah, and moreover, exactly what Freud would see as a disavowal. Why do we do that? Because we're frightened of our finitude. We're frightened of our finitude because it involves death, among other things, and illness, and so on. Sweeping failure, loss, breakdown, and death under the carpet, as many societies do, but America par excellence, and failing then to recognize that the human is possible only on the basis of the inhuman. Only through a solidarity with failure is an authentic humanity possible, as Samuel Beckett, of which Samuel Beckett is perhaps the great poet. For Christianity, the key signifier of human history is a tortured body of a suspected political criminal. Romans, of course, reserve crucifixion for political rebels, who spoke out for justice, whose mission seemed to have crumbled around his ears, and who was done to death by the state for his pains, so that the message of the gospel is not exactly consoling, as my great friend and Dominican friar Herbert McCabe put it. The message of the gospel is, if you don't love, you're dead, and if you do, they'll kill you. There's your pie in the sky for you. You know, there's your nice, consoling religion. Yes. Only by trying to stare the Gorgon's head of the real in the eyes without being turned to stone could there be any hope of new life, with absolutely no guarantees, no, as it were, card of salvation up your sleeve. Only if this frightful trauma is acknowledged as the last word might it prove not to be. Only if you live your death to the full might you have a chance of getting beyond it. Otherwise, you simply buy your affirmation on the cheap, and that's the opposite of tragedy, which has to pay dear for its affirmation, whatever affirmation it can muster. I mean, if Jesus had thought to himself, you know, well, only 6 hours on the cross, then 3 days in the tomb, and then, you know, an eternity of bliss, yeah, I'm up for that, that's fine. Yeah. Who wouldn't be? You know, who wouldn't be? Then, according to Christian theology, he most certainly would not have been raised from the dead. It's because he lived his death to the full in all of its agony and apparent futility. Evil has a lot to do with a sense of meaninglessness and farce and the absence of meaning, yeah. Kind of sniggering at the idea that anything human could be at all valuable, and the Iago complex, if you like. Only by living, only through that radical self-dispossession could an absolute limit possibly become a horizon, which is to say that Calvary is a genuinely tragic action in a very classical sense of the word tragedy. Okay, it doesn't end badly, but then tragedies don't necessarily end badly. One of the first, perhaps the first, and certainly one of the greatest tragedies we have, the Oresteia, doesn't end badly. Tragedy just means that you have to be hauled through hell if you're to achieve any degree of redemption, which is why the first thing that the Christian Church does with a new human being, a baby, is to kill it, symbolically, drown it. Baptism, yeah. Baptism is not about washing, of course, it's about drowning. And as Marx himself, as the early Marx himself comments, only by a loss of humanity can there be a renewal of it. But that in itself, it seems to me, is tragic. Would that were not the case. Would that it were the case that we could achieve a decent degree of, whatever we want, justice and friendship and so on, without having to go through that radical self-dispossession. That's a very tough and perhaps, in the end, impossible thing to ask of us. But such is the crookedness of humanity that only by virtue of a breaking can our powers be remade. And I think that applies on at least 3 different levels. It applies certainly to Christianity, it applies to Marxism, and it applies to psychoanalysis in a different way entirely. This is not, by and large, the conventional liberal humanist understanding of humanity, and it's therefore not the dominant tone today of the humanities. It's far too bleak and extremist and uncongenial for that. On the whole, the humanities have not exactly rushed to acknowledge that their obscene underside has been violence, misery, and exploitation. For every cathedral, a pit of bones. For every great Victorian poet, the maidservants who heated his bathwater. A humanities that could confront that unpalatable truth and not abolish itself in some access of shame or guilt, but reconstitute itself on the basis of that. Now that really would be worth fighting for. Thank you.
Is this coming back? Thank you. We'll throw the floor open to questions. I will just make one observation at the start, partly because Terry was was demoralising the good people of Oxford in the bookshop, I think, earlier, when a conversation that may be relevant here was happening. There has been an interesting extrapolation, I think, of the timelines in which we're thinking about the questions in front of us before. So Catherine started us off with the immediate timeline of what it means for a student sitting in an American institution today to think about the value of the education we're giving them, and perhaps particularly of graduates within that. Emma made it her task very helpfully to put that within the broader historical timelines offered to us by a reading of Dr. Faustus alongside what was happening in this place as it tried to articulate different versions of what a school of English might be, whether it would be a utility-oriented one or a Petarian burning with a gem-like flame. And then Terry has put before us the very long theological perspectives which tend rather to tragedy in this reading than anything else. If I can ask one question about it, the bit of the description I don't quite recognize, Terry, is it seems to me that actually we have recently, as well as historically, been rather good at thinking about atrocity as the basis on which we do what we do as humanists. I'm thinking of people you would have been reading as well. Bruce Robbins is currently working on atrocity as the ground of the humanities and ground we have to get past, but it's Nietzschean terrain, as you know. And one of the reasons that Nietzsche gives up on Schopenhauer, why am I telling him this calls Newcastle, is that there is room for gaiety in this way of thinking about what art and humanity can give. Now, the Nietzschean model isn't going to work in many ways for most of us, but there are other places one can take this. And so I'm going to ask you a double-barrel question. One is, are you being fair to us on our blindness to the bad stuff? And 2 is, what are you going to do with gaiety? That was a very funny performance. You are very funny, and of course, we've all read Beckett. Comedy and tragedy go intimately hand in hand, but I wonder tonally whether what you're offering us is not a little bit brighter.
A little bit?
Brighter.
Brighter, right.
It's so easy to be banal when you take on these topics. Maybe that's where we need comedy.
Is that? Oh, yeah, just yeah. Yes, maybe on the first point, Helen. Maybe you're right. I was perhaps under. Well, to put it the most cynically, underplaying the liberal guilt of people in the humanities. But it's
a lot
not,
of it out
but
there.
it's not
It's
just
radical
that.
guilt, I think.
But it's not just that. I mean, you know, it can be more fruitful and constructive than that. Yes, except that, I mean, I suppose the quotation I have in the back of my head here, which I'm loath to articulate because I have used it and so many people have used it, that it's the famous Walter Benjamin quotation that every document of civilization is also a record of barbarism. Which of course, first of all, doesn't mean that civilization is nothing but barbarism. It's not a reductive statement. It means that those two things are as close as the recto and verso of a single sheet of paper, and it means that we have to somehow find a way of, as it were, X-raying culture and civilization, which would show up the lineaments of the barbarism, which is one of its major sources. I suppose it's not. You're right. It's not that people don't realise that so much as what I'm asking. How would we reconstitute the humanities in a way that would put that to the fore? And it has to be, well, to appeal to a very old-fashioned word, has to be dialectical, a word that was last used when men wore blue denim suits and had sideburns. Because well, of course, in a sense, Marx, once again, I'm sorry to keep insisting on this, is a model of dialectics there, because, of course, Marx thinks that modernity, modern civilization, on the one hand, is an exhilarating emancipation from, the ancien regime, and, in a very short period of time has wiped away almost every vestige of that kind of privilege, leaving just a few of the things around, like Prince Charles, for example, who, but at the same time thinks that history is one long nightmare, and each, moreover, in terms of the other. There's something curious about the mechanisms of modernity which produces the two at the same time. So I suppose I'm just saying, well, what would a humanities which really took that on board look like? And the second question was about humour, wasn't it?
Which, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. Yeah, there is a wonderful book on humour being published next March.
By Eagleton.
Oh, okay. I've no need to say it. Yeah. It's extraordinary how humour is a heavy industry in the States. It's not so much here. I mean, academic industry, not so much here. But anyway, it is. I have a book on humour coming out, followed by a book on tragedy. I like to appeal to all audiences and moods.
The market's doing well for you too.
And the book on humour has an epigraph, which is from a joke by a famous English comedian called Bob Monkhouse that I'm sure Americans won't have heard of, which is simply, they laughed when I said I wanted to be a comedian. Well, they're not laughing now. Sorry, I don't want to go on and so on, but there is, and I don't want to be, that dreadful thing, ethnically essentialist, which we all kind of make the vampire sign. But I do think that this, if I may say so, something rather Irish about tragicomedy. The Irish, my background is Irish. I live in Ireland. There's something, of course, utterly wretched about Irish history. Britain's oldest colony. But there's also a vein of somewhat saturnine, death-driven, dark, bleak humour. Think of Beckett once more. Or humour which, as in the Wildean witticism, tries to momentarily transcend that dreariness, by an intellectual backflip, as it were. So tragic comedy is a very familiar mode in Ireland, which is partly a matter of puncturing British solemnity. I don't know whether the New Zealanders do this as well. Probably they do.
They do.
They do. I'm sure they do. Yes. Yeah, but anyway, that's a different story.
I mean, I imagine everybody's experience is the same of the value of humanities debate. It is a very pious debate in the main. The tonal range is extremely narrow. So it's been good to hear some laughter of various kinds today. Over to you. Questions? Do we have a roving mic at the back? Thank you. Yeah, at the back. Okay.
So I think you claim that certain things should be understood as autotelic in some sense. Sorry. So I think you claim that certain things should be understood as autotelic in some sense. So, for example, maybe virtue or certain qualities, or the humanities. But I was wondering, why shouldn't we follow Aristotle all the way and say that there's only one thing which is autotelic? Maybe some sort of sense of eudaimonia?
Yes. Eudaimonia is autotelic, yeah. Eudaimonia being Aristotle's, being not in fact a term for a lung disease as it sounds, but for Aristotle's term for well-being. Yes, well, that's a good way of putting it. I mean, that's insofar, I mean, there's a sense, I suppose, in which well-being is a telos, in that for Aristotle you have to achieve it, and you achieve it by practice. Being human is something you have to get good at, like playing the violin. And you achieve that for Aristotle by practice, which is, of course, known as he would call virtue, the habit of goodness, developing a spontaneous habit of goodness so you don't have to keep thinking about it in this boring kind of Puritan way, you know, searching your conscience every 10 minutes and all that stuff. But yes, but you can't say for Aristotle, and why should we have well-being? You know, as Wittgenstein says, arguments have to come to an end somewhere. And indeed, there's a point where you have to stop digging. And indeed, for Aristotle, they do. The English translation of eudaimonia as happiness is a rather feeble, sorry.
Flourishing, isn't it?
Yes, and it is. And happiness is a rather feeble word, isn't it? I mean, it's resonant of, you know, people wearing red plastic noses and cavorting around the place, you know, the end of piers in striped suits and so on. But particularly the English are always doing that, you know, any opportunity to wear a red plastic nose that they can. You know. So maybe we need a better term than happiness to translate eudaimonia.
Questions? Let me pitch in while you're thinking that there is something very odd going on, I think, in the funding of humanities at the moment, which is beyond the institutional. If you take this debate, as I know Terry has, to other European countries, and to, you've seen it, the Americans amongst us in America, we have a set of challenges that are framed for us by governments, which are usually called the grand challenges and have to do with climate warming, for example, or aging populations and so forth. When you get into the institutions of the humanities on the ground, in my experience, that's not what they want to talk about. They want to talk about absolutely immediate political, serious problems, the most pressing of which is resurgent nationalism. In Germany is the place where I've had that debate most recently. I know you've been in Bergen very recently. So can I just ask you to step back a little bit from the long historical story you told us from the 19th century to now, because we are in a moment that is very difficult to frame, and the liberal models are out the window, as you know. What are we supposed to do at the moment with this frame of debate in the current political context?
Well, to go back to what I was saying about postmodernism and difference and diversity and marginality and so on, one problem with all that, quite apart from the fact that I say I don't think there's anything in the least inherently positive about difference and diversity, it all depends on the context. But one other problem is that it's just not, in my view, not going to be politically sufficient to resist or oppose what's now brewing up at the heart of Europe and perhaps the heart of the States. So that notions of solidarity between groups in the face of this have become urgently important. And also, I suppose, the realization, going back to the point about so-called dialectical thought, that the populists and the neoliberals are sides of the same coin. they are, of course, antagonists, but the more, the more all you know of the world is, the VIP lounge of an airport where the chief executives gather, flying constantly, then the more you will have people who insist that their particular patch is the only one that matters. And this stalled dialectic between the two, neither of which is adequate, between a fiercely parochial form of nationalism and a vapid and shallow form of cosmopolitanism, is just the way the world has divided down the middle, isn't it? But there's a secret logic or complicity, and we have not to take, it's not so much a matter of backing either side, but of trying to understand that logic. The world is now constituted by people, either by people who believe too much, radical Islamists, so on, or people who believe too little.
Or people who are victims of both.
Yes. I was just about to say Justin Bieber as people who believe too little. But people for whom, for example, the very conception of belief or conviction is dangerously authoritarian. Yes, there are people who are genuine authoritarians and who will slice your head off, and there are other people for whom the whole idea of conviction has become dangerously autocratic. That's why, of course, one reason why so many young people these days, I'm sure there is nobody here guilty of this, use the word like every 4 seconds, because to say it's 9 o'clock sounds unpleasantly autocratic and doctrinaire, whereas to say, it's like 9 o'clock is suitably open-ended, provisional, subject revision, and so on. So this awful situation in which the very notion of conviction, and the point, of course, the reason why people need convictions is so they can be free of situations in which they're unhappy. Would that they didn't need convictions of that kind. But they do at the moment. And we just have to try and look at the logic of this stalled situation in which each camp helps to breed the other.
At the front, thank you.
If I understood you correctly, I was very interested in, and I may have got this a little bit wrong, in what you were saying about how the humanities ended up becoming a kind of slave to nationalist ideology at the end of the 19th century. And if you think back then to the First World War, where there was virtually no resistance to that destructive war, in the universities there was gigantic nationalism and so forth, and the German Socialist Party pretty much collapsed under, or came close to that. But right now, when you come to this, you would be hard pressed wandering around Oxford to say find a Trump supporter or even a Brexit vote here. The academy, as they say in America, has become very politically monolithic. At least that would be, it's an accusation, and there's probably some validity into it. And I'm wondering how that metamorphosis, whether you believe it, and how that fits into your long history of the relationship between the humanities as its role in that dialectical history of the modern world.
Well, one of the advantages of nationalism as an ideology, first of all, of course, nationalism is ironically an international ideology, isn't it? Very few more obviously so. But also, it works. It can work at every social level of class. That when you were talking about the lack of university intellectual resistance to the First World War, for example, Thomas Mann was a raving nationalist, of course, at that point. Then that would be an example, wouldn't it? It's not a class-confined idea. It cuts across class, like feminism does, for example. There are forms of there are noxious forms of cross-class ideology like fascism, and creative forms of them like feminism. So that's very powerful. That's something that you can have a different inflection of nationalism depending on the social background. It's not all necessarily monolithic, but that's one of its strengths, I think. You see, although capitalism will go fascist if it has to, if that's the only way, for example, of defending its profits or of staving off a revolutionary working class, it is, of course, extraordinarily reluctant to do so, because to go fascist robs you of an enormous amount of ideological credibility. You know? And if you can avoid doing it, you do. And what we're seeing now, let's say in Europe and the States as well, in its own way, is not really fascism. I mean, I think it's exaggerated to talk about fascism. It's very important to use the word fascism as precisely as we can and not as a swear word, just a loose word. But certainly a possible precondition for it. But of course, traditionally, fascism happens at times of enormous economic crisis, which make 2008 look pretty well peanuts, And secondly, it normally happens when there's a fear of working class revolution, which is then beaten, but it's beaten back, because I mean certainly one of the problems is that it doesn't, at least in the last great upsurgence of fascism in the heart of Europe, some decades ago, it didn't turn out that popular frontist politics, that is to say, alliances between all good, decent, liberal, middle class, etc., people, could crack it. Yeah, that was one of the failures, of that situation. Anyway, sorry, that's all I...
I know, yeah. Michael, can I just check, when do you want us to run to? Sure.
You talked about politics and culture, but of course in Aristotle, politics is really a form of friendship. So to what degree is friendship essential for the development of the humanities?
Yes. Somebody once said, I can't remember who it is, just as I can never remember whether it was Hegel or Napoleon who said that no man is a hero to his valet. Was it Hegel? I think it was Hegel. Right? Was it Napoleon? Well, they were quite closely alike.
Hegel has a valet, probably.
So I can never remember who was it who said, tell me your definition of politics and I will tell you your politics. What part of what's in contention is different notions of politics, isn't it? That's to say, there's a certain kind of liberalism, which is a classical liberalism, which is essentially apolitical, because its focus is so much on the individual that it's has a rather alienated view of political apparatus and so on. At the same time, there's a different view of politics, which is really increasingly specific to late modernity. That's to say, politics as administration, politics as de-gutted of passions and convictions, and also friends and enemies, and reduced to the rather neutral business of administering, or business of bureaucracy, essentially, where again it becomes a kind of neutral framework within which individuals conduct their lives. But the Aristotelian, and I think Thomist idea too, isn't it, is quite different from that. It is indeed that politics is a form of friendship, and it raises the question I touched on in Marx, namely, how would you establish friendship at the level of a whole polis, of a whole society? You can't do it as long as you think of, you can't have political love, put it that way, as long as you think of love only in the interpersonal erotic, romantic, sentimental, etc. terms in a postmodern society that, in my view, fetishizes sexuality, makes a fetish of sexuality. You have instead to return to the idea of agape, or caritas, in the gospel, which is, of course, that love is not at all personal. Nothing personal about love. It doesn't matter a toss whether you know the person whose place you take in the queue for the gas chamber, or the person who you feed or visit in prison. Absolutely nothing to do. Love is, in that sense, ruthlessly impersonal. It means that you have to love any old body, yeah? Not love everybody in some Coca-Cola-like advertisement, whatever that would mean. Yeah, I love everybody. But and you see, and that also raises questions about postmodern politics. It's nothing to do with ethnicity. It's nothing to do with gender, right? Doesn't matter what ethnicity. In the end, those issues don't matter, and we should be properly annoyed that we have been forced by a racist and patriarchal order to spend so much energy and invest so much work in and thought in issues which in the end are not that important. That we would know we had got over them when our great-grandchildren say, did people really spend all their time talking about these things? Why not talk about something more interesting, like, Prince Charles's ears, for example, which is a fascinating topic. The only thing that can be seen from space satellites along with the Great Wall of China. So we're told.
Back row, and second to back here. Yes. Sorry, am I missing one behind you? Is there? Yep. Okay. That's fine. Yep. It's good.
Me? Okay. Sorry, if I may press my original question again. So you may say that the humanities are autotelic, but it seems to me like they're only valuable insofar as that they promote some further end, that being knowledge of ourselves or something like that, among other things. And that's only valuable insofar as that it promotes personal virtue. And then personal virtue is only valuable insofar as that it promotes us being able to live a good life. And it seems to me if this is the right sort of story to tell about buck passing of value or what is truly autotelic, then the humanities aren't in fact autotelic.
I didn't hear all of that as distinctly as I should have done. It doesn't matter. Yes, you could say that. I mean, but as I say, arguments have to come to an end somewhere. I don't think, for example, that individual virtue exists solely for social and political means. I think it does indeed, but not solely for that. And I don't think that it's possible that insofar as for Aristotle, if we stick with him, eudaimonia is a matter of cultivating the virtues, I think he would reply, he would say, wouldn't he, that it is radically an end in itself. And of course, friendship, to revert to an earlier point, is obviously an end in itself.
The point is that for Aristotle, friendship is not an end in itself. Sorry. So I think the point I'm trying to get at here is that teleophilia, or the like classic friendship, the good friendship, is not an end in itself. It is an end insofar as that it promotes the good life. Because what it is to have a good life is to take part in certain forms of friendship.
Yes, but those, well, okay, you can put it that way. But friendship and the good life are very interwoven, put it this way. I think you're putting it too instrumentally. Maybe I'm, forgetting about the fact that friendship, I'm exaggerating the extent to which friendship is autotelic. But I think it's important also not to put it too instrumentally. To say that friendship is a means to the good life sounds to me a little mechanistic in an Aristotelian framework, but perhaps we read this differently.
John's been mulling on a question, I think, so you have the last question.
Well, can I take you back, Terry, to critique, and to the humanities as critique? I don't want to reduce it to something of, just utilitarian value there. But it seems to me that one of the problems that we face is that the humanities have become, or did become for a while, the main means by which power could be criticized. It took over from, the analytical elements of sociology. And I'm just wondering whether, in fact, the attack on the humanities is an attack on its radical potential, that its capacity to produce knowledge that's rather different from philosophical knowledge. It's a unique kind of knowledge, but it's also a very dangerous knowledge. And that politicians have realized this. And that we are now moving through, if you like, a kind of process of diseducation. And that at times of diseducation, what first arises are demagogues. And I mean, I take your point about fascism, but, what is Trump if he isn't a demagogue? Whipping up people who think they've been disenfranchised, who are clearly not what you would regard as educated and who need to be educated. And to link that with something that somebody said earlier on this afternoon about democracy and education. So I just wonder, how you kind of negotiate that particular problem.
Well, just on the first point, very quickly, the humanities as critique. There is an interesting argument that, in a certain sense, the humanities have acted as a displaced form of critique, not least in British society. That because in British society, no sort of, for various reasons, largely because of an empiricist, very embedded empiricist tradition, no classical sociology or philosophy of the, continental kind really took root. Then it was, as it were, the arts and perhaps particularly literature as the flagship, so to speak, of that, which had to perform that, had to step in and perform that function. This is one's thinking here of around, Leavis and Richards and so on. And the trouble with that, one trouble with that is that literary people we're not really very good at kind of thinking, are we? Basically, I mean, indeed. One reason why the phrase literary theory is yet another oxymoron is because at a certain historical point, literary becomes defined as that which is non-conceptual, which is so sensuously specific that it slips through the net of any conceptual way of seeing. So that there are then problems in bringing that kind of critique to bear, I think, on because I don't know, you need a much more. I think you need a much more analytic and systematic and wide-ranging kind of discourse, and I don't think you can base that in literature. I think there's been a sort of exaggeration of the importance all the way from. At least from Arnold, but in a way before that too, from the Romantics, exaggeration of the role that literature plays. And also, of course, there's always an incipient idealism in the philosophical sense, in literary studies. I mean, of course, we've been working hard, some of us, to develop, as it were, a literary materialism, or whatever that means. But there's always an incipient sense, a latent sense that really it's ideas and values which are where it's at, and therefore, and since for a materialist that's not the case, which is of course not by any means to say that ideas and values aren't important, but you need a form of a materialist analysis which will keep reminding you that vital though these values and meanings are, they're not fundamentally where it's at. And I don't think literary criticism or theory is equipped to do that.
But this is what cultural studies was supposed to fix, isn't it?
I guess, in a way, yeah. I think this is a question I don't know.
Yes.
Just one I wanted to ask you, do you think there's a gap where rhetoric used to be the teaching of rhetoric? That is, teaching people how to be not the path to happiness, course or anything like that, but how to be adversarial and how to express whatever as well as they possibly can. And that used to be true, and I don't think is now. It's a huge skill to be adversarial, to express any opinion with skill and with effect. And that is something, do you think that the humanities should foster? It should be a safe space where anything could be said and where you can utter it, be taught to utter it as effectively as possible.
My old comrade and later adversary, Christopher Hitchens, with whom I used to leaflet at the local car factory at one point, many years ago, once said, if you can talk, you can write, but can you talk? And I have to say, and I say this in no spirit of antagonism or superiority, that when I've taught graduate students in the States, I have despaired of their inability very often to produce coherent statements. I mean, they may be very good on paper, but the ability to speak lucidly and precisely and coherently is absolutely in peril, I think. And if rhetoric is one means of restoring that, then fine. You know.
That might well be a bridge, mightn't it, between self-fulfillment, self-realization, and being useful in the marketplace. Students are well trained in rhetoric, in self-expression, in being adversarial and punchy and speaking as well as the three speakers we've heard this afternoon. That is extremely useful and marketable and would get money, and at the same time would develop self-fulfillment.
Yes, there's of course a long and honourable tradition of rhetoric against the marketplace as well, you know, which they would have to be referred to. Yeah.
We must wrap up. Thank you all very, very much, and can I ask you to extend a hand to Terry?
Very much to Las Casas Institute. Sadly, Richard Finn, who's the director, is rather seriously ill at the moment and isn't here today, but I'd ask you to keep him in your thoughts, and we hope that he'll be back and arguing his way through these problems as well very, very soon. Can I thank also not just our speakers today that we've thanked, but also our rapporteurs and also our administrators, particularly Kinga and the others, Carly also in the United States, for their work. Putting this together has taken some time. It's the first one, as I say. We now go on the road to the Dulwich in March, and maybe other places, but we will be back in Oxford because this is our base. And thanks again to Georgetown and to the Vice President over there who's helped us so much. May we invite you now to have a glass of wine with us outside. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.